Yes, thank you very much, Watanabe-san, for inviting me to talk to you today. I will cover the subjects you mentioned, but I ought to warn you and the audience, I am not a China expert. I have, however, dealt with China throughout my time in the Foreign Service for 37 years or so. So take what I'm going to tell you as my practical observations and conclusions based on common sense rather than expert knowledge. And if what I say falls short of your expectations, please accept my apologies in advance. Let me begin with three fundamental factors about China that I believe have a profound influence on the issues that are the topic of today's talk, but which are seldom sufficiently discussed. And what I'm trying to do in exposing these three issues is to share with you the framework within which I have learned to analyze China. The first factor is a very obvious one, so obvious that it's almost invisible. China is a communist country. Of course, not in its ideology, because I doubt that many people in China today pay anything more than lip service to orthodox Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought, not even Mr. Xi Jinping. He uses Marxist terminology, but that is not the most important thing about Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. China is a communist country, not in ideology, but in its political structure. It is what I prefer to call a Leninist state ruled by a Leninist-style vanguard party, the Chinese Communist Party, that claims a monopoly of power, not just over politics or economics, but over every aspect of state and society. Now, the primary value of a Leninist state and a Leninist party is control, political control. There is no value higher than control in a Leninist state. There is no interest higher than the interest of the vanguard party. And everything is subordinate to the interest of the vanguard party and its control. There can be no compromise on this, only tactical adjustments. Reform in a Leninist state is always to strengthen the rule of the vanguard party, the Communist Party of China. This was true under Mr. Deng Xiaoping, it remains true under Mr. Xi Jinping, and it will remain true under whoever eventually succeeds him. Reform that could threaten Chinese Communist Party rule is just not going to happen. Mr. Xi has immense more power than his two immediate predecessors. He is sometimes compared to Mao Zedong, but that, in my opinion, is a superficial and misleading comparison. Mao Zedong was a revolutionary romantic. He was prepared even to destroy the party if it defied his wishes, as he almost did during the Cultural Revolution. On the contrary, Mr. Xi has stressed party control, party discipline, and the leading role of the party if China is to achieve its ambitions. Now, what are those ambitions? This brings me to the second fundamental factor about China. Contemporary China is not just a Leninist state, but a civilizational state, whose current form is the People's Republic of China, led by the Communist Party. In the Chinese Communist Party's version of Chinese history, the People's Republic of China is China and Chinese civilization redeemed by its leadership after a long period of weakness. Let me explain. Let me explain by reference to two specific issues. Now, why is the South China Sea or Senkaku in the East China Sea important to China? Well, there are mineral resources, there are fisheries, and you know all the stuff, right? But I think they are primarily important, they are core interests, because these territorial claims over what are in objective fact only tiny, not very significant bits of real estate, are inextricably bound up with a nationalist historical narrative of humiliation and ultimate rejuvenation and the realization of the China's dream under the Chinese Communist Party's leadership. This is the core interest. The minerals, the fisheries, all the other stuff, these are secondary interests. Now, this narrative is vital because it legitimates the Chinese Communist Party's right to rule. There has always been a strong nationalist element in the Chinese Communist Party's ideology, and this has grown even stronger after Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up. The South China Sea and Senkaku are not the only parts of China that it claims were lost during its periods of weakness. But to make even claims about the other parts that were lost, for example, Siberia or Korea, North or South, will be too politically costly. The exception is Taiwan, which it still, of course, claims. And no Chinese administration can ever renounce a claim to Taiwan, but to actively pursue reunification at this time is still too risky. So some meat can be placed on the bare bones of the nationalist narrative by which the Communist Party justifies its right to rule, only by making claims in the South China Sea and Senkaku. It is precisely because they are so insignificant in a relative sense that it can do so without too much risk. Now, Mr. Xi Jinping has placed far more emphasis on the nationalist narrative than any of his predecessors, but he did not invent it. It was present from the very founding of the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong used it in September of 1949, and it will persist long after Mr. Xi. In fact, and this is an important point, I think, very much the same narrative of national humiliation and rejuvenation can be found in Chiang Kai-shek's book, China's Dream, which was published in 1947. But of course, with the Kuomintang, not the Chinese Communist Party, as the principal agent of China's destiny. The search for wealth and power to regain what was lost when China was weak is what has motivated different types of political systems in China since contact with the West first forced recognition of its weakness on the late Qing dynasty in the second half of the 19th century. Since that time, no Chinese regime has been considered legitimate if it was unable to defend China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And this narrative is powerful and I think is attractive to most Chinese citizens, irrespective of what they may think about the Chinese Communist Party. And it's attractive even to some overseas Chinese, because if you set aside the oversimplifications and some omissions, it is very largely true. It cannot be denied that Western powers and Japan did try to carve up the Chinese melon from the late 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, nor can it be denied that the Chinese Communist Party succeeded where the Qing dynasty and the Kuomintang failed. This narrative, however, is essentially narrative, revanchist. At its heart, Chinese nationalism as defined by the Communist Party is based on revanchism. That is the recovery of what was lost territory and its corollary, the status that comes from acceptance by other countries of a hierarchy with China at its apex, which in the Chinese political imagination was its rightful place in East Asia. In traditional Chinese political culture, stability requires acceptance of hierarchy. And this invests China's interactions with the world with a sense of entitlement. You should recognize me as the top of the hierarchy. Now, China is not reckless, it's not looking for a war, but because this narrative is connected to the legitimacy of Chinese Communist Party rule, on this narrative and its territorial implications, there can be only tactical adjustments, but no fundamental compromise. And this, of course, has profound consequences for China's relations with the US, with Japan, with Southeast Asia, with India, with other countries too. The third fundamental factor about China is a more subtle point than the other two. In his classic work, his magnus opus, entitled From the Soil, the Chinese sociologist Fei Xiaotong explained the essential difference between Western and Chinese society by reference to the rural foundations of Chinese society. And this, in his analysis, led to the greater immediacy and importance of family and local networks or personal relationships centered on themselves rather than on the institutions of the state. The pervasiveness of the idea of guanxi, or connections, in Chinese culture points in the same direction as Mr. Fay's essential idea. As a result, Fay argued, Chinese society has a deeply ingrained, and I quote, self-centered quality, and traditional Chinese society was selfish. Sun Yat-sen was suggesting much the same thing when he described the Chinese people as loose grains of sand. Such selfish personal networks challenge a Leninist party's basic principle of centralized rule and claim to a monopoly of power and authority. And since 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has continually struggled to transform this deep social structure into something more collective. To do so, the Chinese Communist Party has turned to a variety of ideologies, lately even Confucianism, which it once condemned as emblematic of the reactionary feudal society it overthrew. That is, it is willing to go so far underscores the seriousness of the challenge and its intractable nature. Now, the greater individual agency that the Chinese people have enjoyed since reform started has widened the scope to create and operate these selfish networks of personal relationships. Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era is the latest attempt to assert the kind of impersonal and collective identity the Chinese Communist Party wants to promote for China. But the Chinese Communist Party has itself been constantly plagued by factional struggles based on top leaders controlling extensive networks of personal followers, of personal influence through networks of loyal followers spread throughout and often overriding the formal party structures. Xi Jinping has crushed such networks, for example, that of the now jailed Zhou Yongkang in the security and state energy sectors, but they persist underground. And by insisting that the Communist Party be guided by his own thought, which is now enshrined in China's constitution, Xi Jinping may have created his own personal faction, albeit one that is more transactional and perhaps therefore more brittle than others. Now let me try to apply these three factors to the broader canvas. These three factors account for both China's strengths and China's weaknesses. The centralized and largely unaccountable power of a Leninist state, buttressed by the popular nationalist narrative by which it legitimates itself, is able to take fundamental decisions and pursue them relentlessly with minimal internal dissension over the long term. It can decide decisively, it can pursue its decisions over the long term with very little internal discussion or disagreement. Now, let me give you some examples. In no other system could Deng Xiaoping have taken a cold, hard look at the course that he and his comrades had pursued with tremendous sacrifices over their lifetimes, decide it was all going wrong and in danger of failing, and with minimal internal opposition, abruptly change course, thus changing China and changing the world. No other system can a leader do that. Or to take a more contemporary example, no other system could have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic with such ruthlessness to contain it in a relatively short period of time. The ability to act decisively and over the long term is a great strength. But it is only a strength if, and it's a very big if the decision is a correct one in the first place. If the decision is incorrect, the great strength can become a great weakness. Let's not forget, for example, why COVID-19 was able to spread within China and across the world in the first place. Now, Deng Xiaoping's decision was correct to reform and open up. But Mao's decisions that led to the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were catastrophic disasters. I had earlier said that comparing Xi Jinping with Mao Zedong is inappropriate. But there is one similarity. By concentrating power in himself, by doing away with term limits, and by strongly emphasizing party discipline and control, Mr. Xi may have reintroduced something like a neo-Maoist single point of failure into the Chinese system. Now, by single point of failure, I mean a single decision-making point with minimal room for alternative views, whereby a single bad decision can have a system-wide effect. This is particularly so because there is reason to wonder about the quality of information that is being passed up to top leaders in a system where the cost of dissent, or even just being perceived as dissenting, have been raised by Mr. Xi. The consequences of disagreement with the accepted wisdom in Mr. Xi's China can be quite severe. Certainly, I think such a misjudgment was responsible for the current state of U.S. China relations. The initial mistake probably began towards the end of the Hu Jintao years after the global financial crisis. At that time, China seemed to have begun to believe its own propaganda about the US being in inevitable and absolute decline. And when China may have taken the Obama administration's reluctance to exercise power as a new norm of American foreign policy. It started before Mr. Xi Jinping, but Mr. Xi certainly doubled down on the mistakes. Mr. Xi's signature Belt and Road Initiative and the Made in China 2025 plan flaunted China's ambitions and in fact repudiated Deng Xiaoping's strategy of hiding one's light and biding one's time. It abandoned that strategy. It was not the only reason for the souring of US-China relations, but the dazzling light of China's ambitions as exposed by Mr. Xi was a major factor, and not just with the US, but with other Western and other advanced economies as well. Insofar as there is a nascent coalition of countries with concerns about China or certain aspects of Chinese behavior, it was created not by the US, but by China itself. And this is a remarkable failure of Chinese foreign policy. Now, the problem with abandoning a strategy of hiding your light and biding your time is that once you abandon it, it cannot be reversed. Once you reveal your ambitions and intentions, you cannot conceal them again. People will not forget. So this was a strategic mistake. And even setting aside the broad challenge that Chinese ambitions pose to the US and other countries, the root cause of the grievances of American and other businesses about Chinese unfair policies and practices originate from China's status as a Leninist state. Some of the structural reforms the US has demanded strike at the core of the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power and therefore are just not going to happen. It's impossible for any Chinese business, whether state-owned or ostensibly private, to operate in China without the leave and favor of the Chinese Communist Party, as Mr. Jack Ma recently was rudely reminded of this reality. Business and party officials therefore cultivate networks of mutually beneficial relationships at the local level that creates the uneven playing field and the skewed implementation of laws and regulations that foreign businesses complain about. As these networks operate in that selfish social structure that Fei Xiaotong described, it's often difficult for central authorities, despite all their power, to overcome these distortions in the economy, assuming they really want to overcome in the first place. There seems to be a fundamental mismatch between incentives at the local level and at the center. Now, huge countries inevitably generate internal centrifugal forces. But in China's case, they are accentuated by the personal networks that Fei Xiaotong analyzed and described. You know the saying, the mountains are high, the rivers are deep, and the emperor is far away. So this is not a new condition for China. It's not an epiphenomenal condition. It's perhaps a structural condition against which the Chinese polity has struggled for centuries. Recently, just a couple of days ago, I think, Premier Li Keqiang took the unusual step of ordering local governments to tell the truth about the economy. Can you imagine that? Think about it. The Prime Minister of a country having to order his own officials to tell him the truth. Something is wrong. And we should not assume that the central authorities will always see it as in their interest to correct distortions. Even if new legislation on, for example, foreign investment and protection of intellectual property is passed, as it has been passed, the interpretation and implementation of legislation is always going to be subject to the Chinese Communist Party's interests and the control which is its primary value. In a Leninist state, there can never be rule of law, only rule by law, because the law cannot be above the party's interests, and it's always only an instrument of the party's will to be used or not used as the party's interests dictate. In a country like Japan, Singapore, the law is above politics. In a communist country, in a Leninist state, the law is the subject of politics. It's an instrument of political will, not a check on political will. Now, a few words on technology. We all know that China has made remarkable progress in many areas of technology, but we all also now know semiconductors have emerged as a serious vulnerability in China's capabilities. And it's a very serious vulnerability because these days you need semiconductors for anything that is electronic, for anything that is not purely mechanical. You need some kind of chips for these things, almost everything, even toys. For reasons that I don't have time to elaborate, this is not a problem that can be fixed merely by throwing money at it, which is always China's preferred solution. The choke points in critical technologies, the choke points on critical intellectual property are held by almost all held. In fact, they are all held by Western powers, friends and allies of the United States. Almost all. Right? I'm not arguing that China will never overcome the problem, but at very least, it will take a long time, and the frontier of progress in this technology is continually moving outwards. It's not a moving target. There's not a stationary target they are aiming at. They are trying to catch up with a moving frontier. Now, notwithstanding China's ability to pursue goals over the long term, which I mentioned earlier, it seems to me that the key factor determining success or failure for China in its effort to plug the semiconductor gap, at least in the short and medium term, will be external. It will be US policy is the critical factor. Now, China's semiconductor gap is such a serious vulnerability because so much of China's hopes to move up the value chain to the next generation of industries, as well as its military modernization program depends on it, that once I became aware of this vulnerability, what puzzled me most is why China missed it and allowed it to develop to the present extent. I don't have a good explanation for this oversight on the part of China's planners and leaders, but it may be another example of the downsides of over-centralized decision-making and the single point of failure having a system-wide effect. Narrowing the semiconductor gap will certainly figure prominently in the next 5-year plan, and it was already stressed in the Made in China 2025 initiative. But Made in China 2025 is only 5 years old, whereas the problem is much older than that. A friend of mine with decades of experience in the semiconductor industry, including working in China, told me that SMIC, for example, has been trying for something like 20 years to catch up without much success. The Chinese government has warned against the unqualified industries rushing into the semiconductor industry just to take advantage of the tax and other incentives that the government is offering. A semiconductor company in Wuhan has halted its plans, which is just one example of failures. The semiconductor supply chain is very complex and is hard to break into except at the low end of the value chain. Now, I'll come back to the semiconductor issue later when I talk about Southeast Asia and the future of U.S. China relations. But for now, I want to draw your attention to a much more fundamental even than the semiconductor issue, and perhaps even existential economic issue arising from the Leninist nature of the Chinese state. As early as 2007, 13 years ago, the then Premier Wen Xiaopao warned that China's development was, and I quote, unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and ultimately unsustainable. The Premier himself said that. At its 18th Party Congress in 2012, the Chinese Communist Party officially acknowledged that the growth model that had brought it the spectacular growth in the 1990s and the early 2000s was unsustainable. And at the plenum of the 18th Congress in 2013, it announced a plan to restructure the economy with a, and I quote, decisive role for the market in the allocation of resources. But by the time of the 19th Party Congress in 2017, implementation of this new approach was still hesitant and patchy. Xi Jinping's speech to the 19th Congress had redefined the principal contradiction facing China as that, and I quote, between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life, end quote. In other words, rising expectations across a broad range of different policy domains. To meet these expectations will take time and resources. How much time, no one really knows because China is vast, the problems are complex, but certainly China does not have the luxury of infinite time to address the issues. And while China's resources are huge, they are not inexhaustible. So the problem boils down to generating long-term growth to continually replenish resources to meet the ever-growing expectations. And unless expectations are met, the Chinese Communist Party's nationalist narrative will sooner or later ring hollow. Now, as I've stressed, China is a Leninist state led by a vanguard party. The essence of a vanguard party is insistence on control, not just of politics, but of state and society in all their aspects. The market, by definition, means less control, and not just in economics. The choice between political control and market efficiency is, of course, not absolute. What is required is a new balance between control and efficiency. But where that new balance should be is, however, not always clear. In a Leninist state, once all the easy reforms have been taken, political logic and economic logic are not easily reconciled. China faces a vicious cycle that is difficult to break. What is this vicious circle? Well, it can be described quite simply. Sustaining growth to meet continually rising expectations requires greater economic efficiency. Greater economic efficiency requires a new growth model based on a new balance between party control and the market. Establishing that new balance necessarily entails risk. Mitigating the political risk requires growth to satisfy rising expectations. Sustaining growth requires a new model based on a new balance, and so on and so on. Now, Mr. Xi Jinping has not abandoned the search for greater market efficiencies, but has so far placed much greater emphasis on party discipline and party control. Now, it's not irrational for him to do so. A huge country that has undergone such profound transformations as China within such a historically short period is naturally internally unsettled. It's not clear that there is any practical immediate alternative to the Chinese Communist Party for stability. But by emphasizing Communist Party control, Mr. Xi has also sharpened the difficulty of finding a new balance between political control and market efficiency. And he and the party have improvised around rather than directly confronted this core issue, at least so far. It's too early to tell whether the imperatives of an increasingly difficult external environment will be sufficient to compel the CCP leadership to muster the political will to break the vicious circle that I described. So far, the new so-called dual circulation policy, whose main point is greater emphasis on the domestic economy, seems to me to be old wine in a new bottle rather than a decisive new policy direction. What are the main components of the internal circulation part of dual circulation? Well, they are, as I understand it, industrial upgrading, moving up the value chain. Second, more productive investment, better investment, not wasteful investment. You know, I mean, China, I think investment is now something like 43 or 42% of China's GDP. And if you are investing at that huge percentage of GDP, there must be a lot of waste. It cannot be otherwise. And thirdly, greater self-sufficiency in key technologies, including semiconductors. Greater emphasis on domestic consumption, more urbanization, and better environmental protection. Now, none of this is really new. Most of these objectives already implicitly or explicitly were mentioned in Xi's 19-party Congress speech as among the solutions to the rising expectations that needed to be met. And some of these objectives have their own internal contradictions or lead back to old contradictions. For example, China has been trying to increase consumption as a percentage of GDP for a long time, but with limited success. Domestic consumption seems to have stalled at under 40% level. I think it's now something like 38 point something, 39%. This is respectable, but below the average, I think, for economy of China's size, and well below the US, the Eurozone, and Japan's percentage of domestic consumption. I think Japan, the last I checked, was 56%. Now, how do you raise domestic consumption? To raise consumption, you have to lower the propensity to save. To lower the propensity to save requires better social security nets. It requires, among other things, better quality and more affordable healthcare, better and more affordable housing, and other provisions for a rapidly aging society. Which brings me back to the previously mentioned vicious cycle. Because all this requires more resources requires a new growth model, and so on. It also implies a more serious effort than we have seen to free itself from the addiction to infrastructure investment at home and abroad that has characterized China's economic policies. And all these efforts have been complicated by the heightened U.S. China strategic rivalry and the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for China and for the world. This has pulled economic policy in different directions and accentuated the stresses on the economy caused by, among other things, growing debt and a widening inequality. Let me give you some examples. China wants to reduce carbon levels, and environmental protection is part of the internal part of dual circulation. But it is burning more coal than ever before in order to grow after the pandemic and during the pandemic. China needs to deleverage, and it was doing so. But now it simultaneously needs to stimulate the economy. And some of the measures taken to reduce debt seem to me, at least, to be more accounting tricks than real solutions. For example, converting property secured debt and non-performing loans to bonds and forcing SOEs and others to buy these bonds. It's just an accounting trick to me. It's shuffling the same cards. What you really need is fundamental to deal with the debt problem and the property bubbles and so on. What you fundamentally need is land reform and tax reforms. But this has not yet happened, although there have been some pilot projects on land reform. And as you all know, recently, there have been a number of bond defaults, quite high-profile bond defaults, and more are expected. Recently, China's financial regulators have warned that bond issuers cannot run away from debts, suggesting that some will not be safe if they do so. But the real test of whether or not the Chinese government is prepared to deal with the moral hazard problem is if a major SOE is at risk of default. That hasn't happened yet. Let's see what happens. Now, I want to be clear. Nothing I have said is meant to suggest that China is going to collapse or China is going to fail. I don't think China is going to fail. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party is going to fail. None of us should hope that China fails, because while a successful and assertive China poses serious challenges, a failed and resentful China will pose even more serious challenges for us all. What I'm doing is to point out that China is a country like any other. It has its weaknesses, it has its strengths. And because I believe the US-China strategic competition is a long-term structural condition of 21st century international relations, it's crucial to see China whole, to see its weaknesses as well as its strengths, as otherwise our own strategic choices and judgments may be distorted to our disadvantage. What's the time? Okay, let me wrap up this talk by turning to what we can expect in US-China relations under a new US administration and how this all affects Southeast Asia and ASEAN. The two issues are closely connected to a large extent. Southeast Asia's ability to cope with China, whether economically or strategically, depends on US policy. There is a widespread consensus that the Biden administration will not drastically change direction on China or trade policy, at least not initially. You know the reasons for this, and I need not elaborate. The expectation is that Biden will return policymaking to a more orderly and transparent process with more consideration for the interests of US friends and allies. And this is all very welcome, but it still leaves many questions unanswered. For a start, we do not know what further measures the Trump administration will put in place in its remaining months in office and what Biden will inherit and have to respond to. We'll just have to wait and see, but I will venture some guesses about the broad outlines of a new US policy. There are two aspects, economic and strategic. Let me start with the economic. I don't think Biden will be as trigger happy as Trump about imposing new tariffs on China, but I doubt that he will immediately remove the existing tariffs, although he may selectively ease their implementation. I don't think he will immediately change the entities list, the list of Chinese entities for which you need licenses to export certain technologies, although he will once again, I think, ease its implementation. Why do I think this? I think this because Biden's priorities are domestic. He has said so. Recovery from the health and economic aspects of the pandemic, and that will occupy most of his time for at least his first year in office. The Republicans are likely to retain control of the Senate, and Republicans in both houses of Congress will be cognizant of the fact that although Mr. Trump lost the election, there are more than 70 million Americans who voted for Mr. Trump, who presumably agree with his policies. Biden needs the cooperation of Republicans in Congress and will not pick unnecessary fights with them on what are second-order issues. China trade, these are to him, I think, second-order issues. He will stabilize the relationship, he will calm it down, but he's not going to fundamentally change direction because that may mean a huge fight with the Republicans in Congress. And the first-order issue for him is recovery from the pandemic. Now, whether it is regard to implementation of tariffs or the entities list, the devil is in the details. It's not that he will implement them in a more relaxed way, he will implement them in a more transparent way. But what exactly is he going to implement? And here I must confess that I haven't a clue to what a Biden administration will do, what licenses for what equipment or what components from which companies will be granted. Probably the prospective Biden administration itself does not know right now itself. Now, China accounts for about 40% of the global semiconductor market. It's impossible to cut off all supplies to such a huge market without harming the suppliers. And almost all of the suppliers are American companies or the companies of American friends and allies. Some licenses have already been granted by the Trump administration. Biden may be more generous in granting licenses. But will Biden put America first? Will Biden put American companies first in granting licenses? I don't think we can rule that out entirely. The choice of who will get exemptions or licenses for what equipment or components will be essentially political. It's an essentially political decision. And no doubt there will be furious lobbying in Washington, D.C., and I wouldn't be surprised if that lobbying by various companies hasn't already begun. So if Japanese companies want to get into the act, my advice is start now. Don't wait for 20th January. Some ASEAN countries had hoped that US-China trade friction would lead to the relocation of production to Southeast Asia. Well, some relocation has indeed already occurred, but largely, I think at the low end of the value chain in industries such as garments or simple manufacturing or assembly, and mainly by Chinese companies moving for cost reasons. I expect this kind of cost-driven shift will to some degree continue. However, ASEAN should not expect that the shift will be automatic at the high end of the value chain. There are several reasons for this. First of all, shifting out of China is easier said than done because of the extensive supporting ecosystems that have developed in China for many industries. Nationally and regionally, ASEAN has to develop to match these ecosystems. Second, China is not a market any industry can ignore, no matter what the difficulties. Companies may postpone or scrap decisions on new investments in China, but they are very unlikely to significantly exit China. An ASEAN common market is still largely a theoretical proposition, and ASEAN needs to move more quickly on the second stage of our integration plans to have a chance to attract whatever is going to move out of China, if anything is going to move out of China. This is again easier said than done, although the RCEP may help by its common rules of origin. Third, for the high end of the value chain, for the technological industries in particular, security considerations will still apply, whether the industry is located in Southeast Asia or located in China. This is particularly so in the semiconductor supply chain, I think. There are three broad stages in the semiconductor supply chain: design, fabrication, and assembly and testing. I'm of course simplifying, but I think this is broadly correct. Very few companies integrate all three stages. I think perhaps only Intel and maybe Taiwan Semiconductor. At present in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines are in the semiconductor supply chain, although in my view, none are significant global players. Thailand is mainly in assembly and testing. Malaysia has some wafer fabrication and OSAT, outsourced semiconductor assembly and testing. Singapore has wafer fabrication, OSAT, and some integrated chip design. Vietnam and the Philippines are in assembly and testing. My guess, and I emphasize, is only a guess. My guess is what a Biden administration may or may not do in this semiconductor domain will have only a marginal impact on Southeast Asia. We will all more or less remain where we are in the global semiconductor supply chain. I can't see any of the leading companies producing semiconductors or the equipment for producing semiconductors really moving their crucial high-end technology offshore into Southeast Asia. The really crucial high-end technology is not even in China, it's in their home countries. And in design in particular will remain in their home countries. But let me stress, this is only a guess. My knowledge of the semiconductor industry is rudimentary and I'm still learning. One question that is worth thinking about is what will be the effect on ASEAN of the digitalization of global supply chains and the so-called fourth industrial revolution. New technologies like AI-driven robotics and 3D printing seem to me to be eroding the cost advantages of widely distributed supply chains comprising discrete nodes, because digitalized supply chains are much more integrated. They are not separate as before. If you add this to the political and security related pressures for reshoring, what will be the effect on ASEAN's plans to make Southeast Asia a common production platform? Do our national and regional plans adequately consider the inevitable technological disruptions that may be accelerated by the consequences of the pandemic? There is also a much more fundamental question in my mind. Singapore, like South Korea and Taiwan, basically developed by following Japan up the value chain, taking over industries that those ahead in the so-called flying geese formation discarded for one reason or the other. But what do those countries who are still far back in that formation do if the formation is itself disrupted by digitalization, by the fourth industrial revolution? What do? If the supply chain is fundamentally disruption. Well, digitalization may enable some of the more advanced geese to skip ahead of the formation, but to take advantage of digitalization requires a certain level of development, and those behind may get stuck in place, enhancing inequalities within and between countries. And what does this mean for the stability of Southeast Asia? Well, I must confess, I do not have good answers to any of these questions. There are simply too many unknowns, and because I simply do not know enough about digitalization of supply chains, about the fourth industrial revolution. But I can raise these questions. Let me conclude now with something I do know a little more about, which is geopolitics. As we are running out of time, let me state the essential problem for the new Biden administration, the essential geopolitical problem for the new Biden administration succinctly. And I said it this way: not everything that Trump did was bad, and not everything about the Obama administration, particularly in his second term, was good. In some crucial aspects, the second Obama administration was bad. He was clearly reluctant to use hard power and had little appetite for the realities of strategic competition, particularly in the South China Sea. International relations cannot be all about soft power. And this reluctance, this lack of stomach for competition, led to miscalculations by China about US policy and placed Southeast Asia in a disadvantageous position vis-a-vis China. The situation is not irretrievable, but the Biden administration should not repeat the mistakes of the past. As Obama's vice president, Mr. Biden cannot avoid responsibility for the bad as well as the good, and this is so irrespective of whether he was really responsible or not. Therefore, his every move is going to be closely watched by friend and foe alike for any sign of weakness. And I at least rely on close partners of the US like Japan to advise them in this way. The people are going to be watching very carefully. They're going to be scrutinizing, maybe over-scrutinizing every move that the Biden administration makes. Well, it's still early days, and the nominations for Secretary of State and NSC advisor, which have just come out yesterday or the day before, are encouraging. But who Biden nominates for Defense Secretary will also be crucial. I hope that the Biden team, if it is confirmed, will not overcompensate for the disruptions of the Trump years. As I said, not everything was bad. One of the most important things the Biden administration can do to reassure Southeast Asia, indeed reassure the entire Indo-Pacific, will be to re-engage on the CPTPP. Unfortunately, I don't think this is likely until the midterm elections, and even then it will depend on the results of those elections. All this is too far in the future to make even a guess. So I will end here. Thank you very much for listening to me so patiently.